So we were please continue. So yeah.
Okay. I won't go through my life history, but anyway, I just mentioned the things that are pertinent or feel like they were really important for me. So most recently, I think I started in 2017 or possibly, I trained or started training as an end of life doula. And that actually was a kind of an extension of my nursing experience, really. But the training itself gave me an opportunity to start to experience sitting in a group of like-minded and open-hearted people who also wanted to talk about death and dying and how we support and offer love and care for not just people who are dying, but their family, and the way that someone actually has that experience of passing on, passing away. So that has been pretty crucial, really, in where I am now. And then in the spring of 2019, my older sister died unexpectedly. She was ill in intensive care for 3 weeks, and I sat with her for a lot of that time. And I knew then, as I sat there, and I've written this, and people will have heard this before, that everything that I had done in my life to that point was to prepare me for sitting with my sister. My nursing, the end of life doula training, my life coaching training, all the skills that I had, I probably used every single skill during that 3 weeks in just being there, being able to sit with her, supporting family, challenging staff. It was, I don't know, a life-changing experience. Obviously, it was loss. It was a major loss. It is still a major loss. My beautiful sister. But then in the summer of 2020, no, let me get this right, 2020, I was introduced to Rose Diamond. And that was almost like, oh, okay, this is the next step in my grieving journey. And Rose has spent years writing about her own experiences of death and grief, and in such a beautiful, beautiful, deep way. So I've been working with Rose for nearly 2 years, and deepening my practice as a facilitator. So facilitating circles and groups for people to explore those feelings of loss and grief, of sadness, of sorrow. I call it touching the tender places, because for me, those tender places are the things that we don't want to go, where we don't want to go. I always see darkness when I talk about tender places. It's like we tuck them deep, deep inside of us. And, you know, I've worked with people. I met a man who told me that his mother died 30 years ago and he had never spoken to anyone about it. And I just found that so shocking, really. How sad. And then, you know, as he was able to open up, he was able to cry and to really start to grieve and touch the sorrow, touch the tender place that he'd never touched, you know. So, yeah, I feel very, it's funny, really, because I never saw this coming. You know how, I mean, like many people, I've had coaching, I've had business plans, I've done it all, you know, over many years. You're smiling, so I know you recognize this. But what I'm doing now, I never did any preparation for before I met Rose. It all came from, oh, this is my life journey. This is my spiritual journey. And that is, it's such a, I don't know, can I use the word lovely? It's a wonderful place to be, to know that this just comes from the heart, you know, rather than trying to, it just has never suited me to have that kind of planning, especially the word business. I mean, I tried doing that and it didn't really work for me. So that's how I'm where I am, really.
I'm really intrigued on so many things you said there, Jackie, but one that really, I hear a lot of people looking for purpose, and what I'm hearing, my interpretation of what's coming from you at the moment is that you feel like you're in it feels like you're in some kind of alignment, that you feel for a lot of fulfillment in what you're doing. And so I'm just intrigued to rewind back to that choice. You said there was a moment that there was almost a choice to maybe do this training or take this path. And I just wondered if you could say a little more on if there was a prompting or what led you to move in this direction.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's why I've done quite a lot of reflection about, my nursing career. It wasn't all kind of plain sailing, is that the word expression? There was a few hiccups in my nursing career, but the work that I remember so clearly is about one particular baby whose family I supported for like 5 days. They just kept coming back to the unit to hold the baby. So every day I had to go down to the mortuary to get the baby. And I had staff on the unit who really, like junior staff nurses, who was way out of their experience. And they just didn't want to do it. The thought of somebody coming to hold their baby, their dead baby, for 5 days on it, was just, and as I say it, it does sound strange, but it was one of the most transformational experiences in my life, and certainly at that time. So I suppose without realizing it, I started on that journey and made those choices because I made the choice to commit to that family. Even though I guess I didn't really question it. I think, for them, it was part of their religion to commit that time to being with the dead. For me, I wasn't in a particularly religious place or even spiritual awareness, but I just knew that this was something that I could offer to this family. And subsequently with other families, not the same, and never had that experience again, but just being able to be with a family as they held their baby who had died. I found a real sense of purpose and almost joy in that. Yeah. And I think that's continued. So when opportunities have arisen, which I haven't sought, that's the whole planning thing. Like with the death doula training, I just was talking to someone one time. I was at a death cafe actually, and she told me about this training that she'd started, and I knew immediately. I have a bit of a thing, Graham, that I've grown into, as an older woman, which is if you don't get a strong yes, don't go, don't do it, and certainly for the last few years, that has really stood me well. So when I get a strong yes, I'm like, okay. And I apply that to quite a few things really in my life. So the grief and loss work, yeah, very loud yes.
There's an interesting, and I'd like to explore that a bit, because that's such, I think there's a profound teaching of what Lao Tzu calls the path of least resistance. And I think that kind of ties in to what we call the wisdom of the heart. And if there was a wisdom teaching, there's a lot of, I suppose, negative influence around what Steve Jobs brought to the world, but he also provided an incredible wisdom teaching. I think it was Harvard University, about finding your purpose. And he said, in essence, your heart already knows what you're meant to become. And it's like our head gets in the way with its kind of, but even, and he kind of almost says in the way that you're saying of trusting the events of your life, even though they don't make sense sometimes, that they're all bringing you into this way of the heart, this natural yesness, If there's anything you'd like to say on that, that's beautiful, Jackie. But a question that arose in me as you were speaking was, And I think you highlighted it when you spoke about these people's religion as they were holding their baby. And one thing that really strikes me is that the different cultures have different approaches to death and dying. You know, for example, in India, the family will literally set by the cremation, you know, and by the Ganges, and there'll be a part of watching that body dissolve and go away. And there's I know Eckhart Tolle, I think in one of his talks, or perhaps his book, he talks about many of the ancient cultures that expose themselves to death. It's a big part of it. And in the Eastern traditions, it's said that it's very wise, and even in Christian mysticism, to meditate on death every day, because it's part of the practice. You know, oh, this, you know, and the worshippers of Shiva, they cover themselves in the ash of their bodies and meditate on the cremation grounds to remind themselves of that. I think Eckhart Tolle was saying in his book that in the West, instead of doing those things, we actually put makeup on dead bodies.
Yes.
And we say that they're resting, or they're asleep, and he says it's very interesting. The mindset of the standard Western mind is a rejection of that idea of death, you know. So I suppose it's just an exploration of any insights you have around that, really. If what you've seen culturally, if that's all right, is different in the experience of death, or anything you want to speak to around that, or anything else that comes.
Yeah, it is really interesting, Graham. And I did, as part of the doula training, I did a little bit of research studying around different cultures, and all it highlights is how badly we do it, you know, in the West. Although certainly through the doula work, that has opened people up some more. And also the whole thing now of, you know, people are becoming much more aware that you can have the funeral that you want, you can do whatever you want, which, you know, 30 years ago, probably we were much more traditional around funerals and how we said goodbye. So I've been to a few funerals that have been quite different. But yeah, it's interesting. I think as the Dalai Lama starts every day thinking about his own death. And that goes with the whole sort of Buddhist concept of impermanence, which I think we, as a society, we try to deny that, don't we? You know, so it is interesting. And again, on the doula training, we spent a whole day focusing on our own deaths, which was pretty challenging, to be honest. And it did include, you know, when you're dying, what do you want to have around you? Who are the people who you wouldn't want to be there? And if you had a doula, what would you be asking that doula? And quite often people talk about, I want to make peace with people that I haven't spoken to for years, particularly, you know, family members. And when I was working with an old lady, she asked me to write letters to sort of great-grandchildren that she hadn't seen for many years. And we never posted them, but I think she found that incredibly helpful, to be thinking about what will happen once she has died, what will happen within her family, and, you know, that notion of making peace with everything beforehand. It strikes me that if we think about our death every day, it makes us so much more aware of each moment, not just in a sense of like, oh, this might be my last moment, but more, I want to make this moment as good as I possibly can. I want there to be joy in this moment, or I want to be of service in this moment. You know, I think that's a helpful way of looking at life. The death, yeah, when you talk to people about thinking about their own death or being aware of death and impermanence, sometimes people get a bit, they want to step back from it because it's like, oh, how morbid. You know, why would I do that? You know, that's so negative. Like, well, no, actually, it's reality, and death is part of life. That's the conundrum, isn't it?
It's really beautiful, something you mentioned before as well, Jackie, about, I suppose it comes into Freud's and Carl Jung's idea of the unconscious, that what we resist persists. And what you're describing is, even around the death of the baby, was actually the way that you described this conversation, touching those tender parts of ourselves and in a way turning to face those uncomfortable emotions. And that we might have an idea that actually facing those shadows is terrifying. And it might be initially, because I guess we built a story or a belief system around that shadow, which we have to deal with, that may or may not be true. But actually, the way you described it is that actually it's the same as you know, a Buddhist or a mindfulness concept, that when we really touch on the shadow, it quite often it disperses, and what arrives instead of it is this sense of freedom. It's like, as Freud said, the underlying, the greatest principle, the greatest shadow we have in ourselves, the shadow from which all of the shadows are built, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but along those words, is the fear of death. And actually, when we really face that, it's the paradox of the Tao is, you know, it would be, if Lao Tzu was to say it, to understand, to truly live, we have to embrace death. And or when we touch on death, we actually, as you're describing it, we experience more life, more beauty, more joy, which is counterintuitive for, I guess, a logical mindset. So yeah,
it's what, you know, I use this phrase, the gifts of grief, which I was working with someone recently, and he had not long since lost his wife. And he said to me, I can't hear that, Jackie. I can't accept that. How can there be gifts in my grief? I'm absolutely torn apart. And he was on an 8-week course. And towards the end of that course, he began to understand what those gifts might be. And for me, the fundamental of the gifts of grief is that, as you've just said, really, as we open up to those deep emotions, we offer ourselves loving kindness. And that, for me, you know, it's a Buddhist teaching of that underpins everything. But we have to start with ourselves. And when we bury this grief, when we try and we behave as if it doesn't exist in our lives, as with any deep emotion, which all connects with loss and grief, because we may not have lost a person, we may not be experiencing bereavement, but there is loss in everyone's lives. Be it, you know, childhood trauma, be it, I mean, COVID is a prime example, isn't it? You know, we've all been through nearly 2 years now of a pandemic, of seeing people losing their lives to this. I mean, thousands and thousands of people. As a society, we are grieving. And the beginnings of that for me are offering ourselves loving kindness and compassion. And when we start to do that, then I can visualize these little cracks opening up deep, deep down, that we're able to, even if only briefly, really feel those deep emotions that we've tried to close off to. And I think in a way, COVID will enable that, you know, because people are writing about it more, people are talking about it more. I see it on Facebook more, how people are struggling with all this loss of identity, loss of job, loss of freedom. And when we're able to see that loss as a gift, I hesitate because I know it sounds almost ridiculous, but the gifts of that grieving are just immeasurable when we start to open to ourselves, and then we're able to offer that to others, that loving kindness, the compassion. And that might be in a very practical way, or it may be in a very private way, that we hold them in our hearts, you know.
When you say gift, it's beauty. I actually hear the hesitation, and I understand it, because it's there's people who might hear that, or there's maybe a fear of people may hear that, and they use it in the way that we could call toxic positivity. In other words, someone who genuinely is terrified of death might then go out and say to someone who's talking about death with them, oh no, it's a gift, it's a gift. You know, it's that kind of fearful response to this, which creates that actually is the opposite of what you're saying. What you're saying is by learning to have compassion towards ourselves, loving kindness within the experience of the grief, and then within that we can start to see the gift of it. Then we can start to see the wisdom, the healing potential, the clarity that come from that. I guess that's the way I'm interpreting what you're.
Yeah. One of the things I would say though is it's for many people, probably for most people, that's a difficult step to take alone. And so certainly, I mean, I had some counselling like a year after my sister died, and it was incredibly helpful just having somebody, a professional, sat opposite me who just nodded. She didn't say very much. She just nodded and just kept open that invitation for me to explore and cry and be angry, you know, all the things that we try and suppress. I was able to sit in that room and just let all of that be released. And the work that I'm doing now, the Sitting with Death and Choosing Life program and community, what we offer is facilitated groups, so that we're on Zoom, and it works wonderfully in my experience, sitting with others who have also experienced loss in different ways. And some of those people, it's been 20 years and they've never really spoken of it, not in any meaningful way or in any way that brought any kind of release. And I have experienced transformation in people's lives through this work. I guess that's, you know, when we talk about the gifts of grief, for me personally, those gifts there's all kinds of gifts. But if you had suggested to me after my sister Rosemary died that this was a gift, I mean, how would I have responded to that? You know, don't be crazy, you know. And yet that is exactly what's happened. And it would make Rosemary smile and laugh to know that that's where I am now because of her, you know. And when we begin to grasp that, it just, you can almost see the relief, you know, the weight that kind of drops away from us as we're able to acknowledge, you know, the sadness, because it is very deep emotions, and also within that trauma. You know, I know my own experience with my sister and other family members, but particularly with my sister. I've only recently, in the last few months, used the word trauma. You know, I wasn't able to accept it for myself.
And what I'm intrigued as well, and I hear the trauma, and I guess part of the process you're describing is that when we can touch those tender places, we can start to release some of that trauma. And I'd love to explore that a bit with you. As you're talking, it's interesting because there is this idea of spiritual bypassing in the spiritual, and what it really means, spiritual bypassing, as far as I can understand it, it means to not notice our pain, not kind of almost like in the chakra system, we could say, shut the heart down below and just stay up here in the everything's astral and beautiful, but not dealing within the human condition. It reminds me of it's a story attributed to the Buddha, but actually it wasn't the Buddha. It was one of the great Zen masters who took Chan Buddhism to Japan. And the famous story is that one of his disciples, who was at the time was a young woman, her baby had died, and she was overcome with grief and didn't know what to do. So this Zen master says to her, "I'd like you to go to all the houses in the village and collect a grain of rice from each household that hasn't been touched by grief and death." And so, of course, she goes to all the households and then returns, and he says, "How much rice do you have?" And she says, "I have none." All the households. But then the common story that is shared stops there, but it didn't stop there. So at this time, this great Zen master looks into her eyes and starts crying, and she's blown away because he often doesn't, but he's sharing in her pain. And in sharing in her pain, they feel this transmutation. So firstly, she gets the wisdom that grief and death is a part of life. And then secondly, it's like, it's okay to feel the pain, to cry, it's okay. And so they stand there in the pain, and through that, there's some kind of transmutation of the pain. So
beautiful. Yeah.
It's such a beautiful story. I can't remember that he's such a profound Zen, and I just, his name won't be shared with me at the moment. So anyway, I suppose a question would be, what changes do you see in yourself and in people as you start to have this ability to touch on this grief and pain? Very briefly as well, another very quick story is I was there at my father's death. You know, my dad died when I was 21 of cancer, and I was sat by his bed, and I was experiencing a lot of grieving, as were the people around the bed at the time. And then I had what I would call my first spiritual experience, and I use that term loosely, as my dad died. And my experience was that as he let out his final breath, they call it the death rattle sometimes, you know, as there was that, and his eyes opened, and somehow in that moment, I knew he'd left his body. It was like he just wasn't there, but it wasn't like he doesn't exist anymore. There was a very tangible experience of, oh, that wasn't my dad. Like what my dad is now is something else that I was unaware of. And there was some grieving, but from that point onwards, I was touched by such a profound feeling of peace in my life that it was I guess it was the foundation of or a massive part of the start of my spiritual journey. And sometimes I've asked myself, do I need to grieve more? Because there was a few times, like at the funeral, I cried a little. And then I remember having a dream a year later in which he appeared in a dream, and we were sat having dinner, and then I woke up and started crying, like with tears in my eyes, because it was like, oh no, he's not alive anymore. Like in the dream, I thought it was real, and then I realized he was gone. So whether that dream was helping me release some of the pain. So I guess, yeah, that would be my big question. What changes do you see in people that are able to touch on that grief, including your own experience, I suppose?
Oh, thanks for sharing that, Graham, about your dad. Well, I think my first response to that really is, as you've described with the story, being able to sit with other people's pain is a gift of grief, and I do that in the work that I offer, and I do that in my life. It is a gift, and it has come from sitting with death and choosing life. It is, and I see it in others, that capacity to hold space for other people. Sometimes people are not even aware that they have that gift, which is interesting. But we all know of people who are not able to do that because they still have all their own grief and pain, as you've described, you know, just below the surface. So I think that is the major one. And from that also comes the compassion, that compassion for others. Like, you know, when we see pictures on TV or Facebook or whatever of people suffering, I'm thinking particularly around, you know, refugees in boats and all of that. And as a society, we choose to turn away from that mostly.
Is that turning away from our pain that's associated? I wonder if that's, we can't allow ourselves to feel what that must be like on an unconscious level because it feels too overwhelmingly painful. Yes. And I think that's when that's the spiritual bypassing. We bounce into blame or instead of really being able to feel that and then working from that experience.
But sadly, we also live in a society where people seem unable to go underneath that, you know, to give people that, allow people to be in that space of like, oh, it's because, you know, like, oh no, I don't want to go in there.
Okay.
Can't remember the question now, Graham. So
I suppose it was in it, and there was an intrigue to know, like, how, I mean, you could also relate to that situation you described, when either collectively or individually we're able to really touch on that desire to run away from pain. You've described it yourself quite beautifully, Jackie, that what you've seen in yourself is that when you're able to sit with your own pain around grief and loss, that this is again a spiritual concept for me that I see, that when we're able to face our shadows, it gives us the ability to face that same shadow in other beings with more compassion. So for example, if I can say, you know, for an example, I see that within me is what loosely worded bad thing in every being on earth. There's a murderer inside of me given the right situation. There's a guard at Auschwitz inside of me given the right situation. That actually, when I can really, this is the idea of shadow work, that when I can really see that I'm no better than anyone else, that like however much light and clarity I get, it doesn't necessarily make me superior in any way, but instead it realizes how delicate and painful the human condition is, and how easily from a place of fear, unconsciousness, we can be led into all the dark alleyways that all of society could be. It's that when I can see that, but not only see it, have compassion towards, if you like, let's call it the pain or the fear behind that, when I can touch on that, somehow it makes me more compassionate. So I guess, so the original question was, I guess, the differences, and you may have answered it already, the differences you see in yourself as you started to heal or touch on those parts within your own being.
And just to pick up on what you were saying about the grieving for yourself, we all grieve in very different ways. I think I probably identify with you in that, you know, grieving has never reduced me to not being able to do anything or to leave the house, but I am aware and I know of people who have been in that place for a long, long time. But there's no judgment about the way that we grieve or how we work through or how we heal, you know, because it's, each of us have a whole history of the way that we've been brought up, people that you know are closest to us, people that have impacted on our lives. So all of these things will affect, first of all, the way that we grieve, and then also the way that we treat ourselves. And I was reading something recently about a woman who, she was writing about just the inability to accept and love herself. And it made me cry. I just found it so sad. You know, a grown woman who was so stuck in such a place. And again, these can be the gifts. The other thing to touch on as well is this idea of grieving well, which is a course that I led last year, and it comes into a lot of the work that we do as part of the program community, is how can we grieve well? And obviously, again, that's very individual, but there are certain elements to grieving well. And obviously it is about accepting that grief, not judging yourself, making time for yourself, for grieving, you know, because again, like in a work situation, you might be given a few days compassionate leave and then you're back at work, and sometimes nobody ever speaks of it, you know. So that's another invitation to just, oh, you know, you're okay, you don't need to talk about it, you just bury it, you know. And again, that's a very societal, cultural thing, isn't it?
Just a question as well on that, Jackie. It's something that I've thought on a lot about, the middle ground of emotion. And I think there can be a tendency, I don't know if it's like the stiff British upper lip, as they call it, you know, that historically of almost not allowing ourselves to experience emotion. Now, I think there's a middle path of that. They describe in the East that there's the yin and yang balance, and that the yin is the heart and the yang is the intellect. And they say, you know, that when we have the harmony of head and heart, we have that Tao, that way of balance. And so what am I trying to describe here? I think, yeah, I suppose your meditations on emotion, I think there's a place for not just like an emotion run wild, you know, but there's also a place for being able to experience emotion and not suppress it. And there's some kind of, you know, going again in these Eastern cultures, they try and find the balance of that. You know, what they call the Shiva Shakti balance, the intellect and the heart. The idea is that if it's just heart, that can be like the water element. It can be like a hose pipe that's been let go of. If it's just the intellect, we can become hard and without compassion. And it's almost like, so I guess I suppose my question is, in your experience, what is the wisest way to feel or express the emotion of grief? I'm not that there's a rule around it, but what have you found useful within your work?
Yeah, for me, I find writing or journaling. I'm not a great writer, but I journaled for many years on and off, not, you know, sometimes every day and then nothing for months. But journaling is so helpful in so many different ways. And I've run sessions on journaling, and we always start from a simple place to start is to write gratitude, either the beginning or the end of the day. So you might start with, say, 5 things that you're grateful for today, or 10. And that can sometimes just stay on the surface, but often after you've been doing it for a while, you see how helpful it is to just dig deep to be, and you know, the things that I'm like, if I'm doing it at night, it always starts with, I'm really grateful for this comfortable bed.
Wonderful.
You know, and then as the list goes on, it's like, you know, I'm grateful that I'm able to feel sadness and to share someone else's sadness, you know. So that's, I find journaling really helpful. The other thing that I've been learning is what I'd call body work. So, you know, as well as meditation and talking, embodying these emotions and these responses is really helpful. That could be, as you know, qigong. But also recently I had an online retreat, a Buddhist retreat, and we did tapping. all over the body, and it felt fantastic. I mean, I know about EFT, but I'd never done a whole body tapping, and it took about, I don't know, probably spent at least 10 minutes just tapping, and I just felt this soft energy that came through that. And then we did a little bit of qigong, and then we jumped up and down on the spot, and it felt fantastic. My knees were not so grateful, but it felt really good. Like my body is not separate from my emotions or my language, or it's all, we are all one. And so to not include the body in absorbing some of these emotions and releasing, dancing is another great one, isn't it? I was listening to Ronnie Spector died this week, sadly, so I was listening to the Ronettes the other day and dancing around the kitchen, and it just felt so good to do that. So for me, things like 5 rhythms is really helpful, or just going clubbing, why not? So anything that includes or acknowledges that our body is all part of this response to grief, to sadness. Maybe it includes shouting or screaming or crying or laughing. And as you know, I used to offer laughter yoga, and that's another great way, just laughing. And when you start with that, you're not really laughing, you're pretending, but soon it takes over and you have this belly laugh, which no one seems, I don't know where it comes from, but it's for real. And I used to love offering those sessions. Yeah. So those are 2 things. Certainly working in groups is incredibly powerful. And I would recommend that, because that's, that is the work that I'm involved in. So
beautiful. They say, well, I'm aware you have a swimming appointment in 10 minutes, so I'm going to start to wrap up a little bit. But just in reflection to that, I was reading about PTSD and body movement, and they found that from the reports I've read, the scientific reports I've read, they seem to be saying that one of the best types of, if you like, specific mindfulness approach to complex PTSD and PTSD is actually Tai Chi, because of its movement, because you're actually processing that emotion through not just the mind, through consciousness and awareness and all the mindfulness techniques, but also because you're actually physically moving the body at the same time. So yeah, I really honor and reflect back that is definitely my understanding as well. What I want to do,
you mentioned my swimming, Graham, and I found swimming, I've been swimming for a few years now, not brilliantly, but and I just find, as soon as I'm in the water, be it outside or in a pool, I just feel that flow. The flow of the water is just it is, again, it's just this release. And the same with walking. I mean, I prefer walking out in the hills, but any walking, I can, it can be very, very mindful. So I'd recommend all of those things. Yeah, for sure.
Well, Carl Jung took himself, my counselling tutor, who was a big Carl Jung guy, he said that when Carl Jung had his breakdown, he did the same, I think, as Abraham Lincoln did when he had his breakdown, which these breakdowns seem to be a very big part of a spiritual awakening for a lot of people, or deepening into the process. And they simply took themselves to nature. He had all this massive skill set. He was said to be a genius of consciousness and the workings of the mind. But when it came down to it, he just went to nature for a few months and just found the Tao, found his way back into that natural balance of things. I want to give you just a few minutes, if you want, a few minutes to tell us about the course that is it a course or a series of lectures you're offering online?
Well, we're having a launch. The whole program is called Sitting with Death and Choosing Life. It's led by Rose Diamond. It's based on her writings and her work, which I have found so helpful. But it's also a community. So we are a group of people, and we are wanting to welcome more people into that community. So there's a launch, and then we're offering a foundation course. The launch starts on the 24th of January. There'll be a session every day. It's just conversations, really, a different sort of aspect of grieving and loss. On the Tuesday, I'm doing a session with a colleague from New Zealand, and we're talking about grieving well and what does that mean. So there's different things each day, and you can sign up for that. It's all free and it's all on Zoom. It's a different time each day as well. So, and I think when we post this, the details will come underneath, or it's on my Facebook page anyway. And
I'll add the link to
message
this
Yeah,
video.
yeah. So you can click on the link and you sign up, and then you get a confirmation email, which you have to acknowledge, and then you'll get all the details for each day. So I'm really very excited about it. It's something that I've been doing now for 2 years. We've piloted it, we've tested it. I've read a lot of Rose's stuff. In fact, I'm using something at the moment. She's written a whole program called Writing Your Way Through Grief. And she uses her own experience, but then inquiry questions. So I don't know whether you're familiar with inquiry questions, which take you deeper each question. And those are really helpful, questions that really kind of make you kind of, wow, I've never thought about that before, or that's really hard to reflect on. So Rose and I are going to have a conversation about that writing. I think it's on the Friday. Yeah, so there's and then an opportunity to become part of that community, to have ongoing conversation, and maybe join us in some of the courses. There's about 4 of us in the team who are going to be offering the foundation course at different times during the week. That's an 8-week course.
What's it? Who's it aimed towards specifically? I guess anyone could come and get something from it, but is there a certain focus of people going through grief, or?
I would say it's probably focused on people who have some awareness of grief and loss, but perhaps also have a kind of spiritual awareness. And it's probably not ideal for people who have had a very recent bereavement. Although, having said that, I have had someone on a course, and it set him off on a wonderful journey of being able to speak to people in his family that he'd not been able to talk to about the death of their mother. And, so the best thing really is, if people aren't sure, is to make contact with Rose or someone in the team. And you can do that, through, I think my emails, I think everybody's email is on all the information. So I found it quite helpful. I've had a few people where I've had a phone conversation with them to enable them to kind of make a decision, or for me to say to them, perhaps this is not quite the right time for you just now. So it's all very individual, but it's very powerful stuff. I'm really loving being a part of it.
Thank you for that, Jackie. And anyone who's listening this, we will check the comments area of the video afterwards. So if there's any burning questions or anything we haven't been able to answer, I'm sure we'll be able to send you a little response to that, or a link for more information. I've just really enjoyed catching up with you, Jackie. I mean, it's great, because this is a conversation I'd like to have anyway. So the fact that we can do this, and in a way that hopefully may offer some kind of insight for anyone else listening, is such a beautiful thing to be able to do.
Yeah, thanks so much, Graham, for this opportunity, and just lovely to see you again and talk to you. We have such great conversations. I always remember the very first one. I think it was in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. And I was like, whoa, who is this man?
I know, it's amazing that you're still talking to me. Well, Jackie, I feel the same, and it's beautiful to catch up. Please enjoy your swim.
Oh, thank you.
And we will catch up outside of this very, very soon. We'll have a chat,
Yes, yeah.
Okay, God bless. Have a beautiful day, lovely.
Thank you, and to you.
You're welcome. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.